This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for April 17th, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey, everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi.
We have a fantastic show for you today. Adam looks into the Atacama mummified skeleton, and I explore Godwin's Law. But first, Pat, treason tags. What's that all about?
So I wanted to cover this because I saw it make the rounds on Facebook several times in the last couple of weeks. It's an image macro of a clothing washing instruction label. Christina, I showed this to you. Adam, Darren, any idea what I'm talking about?
I don't think so.
Actually, no, I'm unaware.
All right, well, it looks like a picture of a run-of-the-mill garment tag. The text below the image says, "This is a clothing label from a small American company that sells their products to France." I'll read the English. Wash by hand in warm water. Use mild soap. Dry flat. Do not bleach. Do not machine dry. Do not iron. Seems pretty typical. Now, all of the TRC panel speaks some French, but one of us is a native francophone. So maybe I can ask Adam, can you read the French part line by line, and we'll translate it one at a time.
Let me pull it up here. Laver à la main à l'eau tiède, savon doux, étendre pour sécher, ne pas javeliser, ne pas sécher à la machine, ne pas repasser. Nous sommes désolés que notre président soit un idiot. Nous n'avons pas voté pour lui.
Okay, so
There's
up
a
until
few
that,
accents missing, but that's the idea.
so up until that last sentence, it was the same. Wash by hand in warm water, use mild soap, dry flat, do not bleach, do not machine dry, do not iron. But that last sentence is an extra sentence. So what does that mean, Adam?
Basically says we're sorry that our president is an idiot. We didn't vote for him.
Right. Okay, so this image macro and comments about it seem to suggest that this is a small American company taking a shot at Donald Trump. My initial reaction was to think that this is kind of funny, but I question, is this really a garment tag? Mm-hmm. So, is this true? The answer is, sort of. It is an actual washing care instruction tag found on backpacks and laptop cases produced by the manufacturer Tom Bin of Port Angeles, Washington. However, it's from 2004.
Oh.
So it has absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump. It's also made the rounds during the Obama administration with the suggestion that it was a shot at him, which is also untrue.
I was going to say, how many times has this made the rounds since it popped up in 2004?
Right. So it also made the rounds in other countries, particularly in France, where some customers believed that the reference was to then-President Jacques Chirac.
But how would that make sense since the insinuation is the label was made by an English person, so that would be read by a French person, but I guess that interpretation could not necessarily be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. So in 2004, when these tags were first noticed, most consumers viewed the message as a deliberate slam of then U.S. President George W. Bush. Tom Bin, president of the company, said he doesn't know which of his 10 employees are responsible. Quote, "They know my French is so bad they could sneak it past me." He said if he was to find out who did it, he'll, quote, "give them a raise."
Oh, wow.
That's great.
That might be a trap.
He then goes on to suggest that it struck a chord with many consumers because, quote, "people out there think a number of presidents are idiots." But it suggests that the reference is to him.
Oh, president of his own company.
According to the company's response, the message began as an inside joke among seamstresses and staff at the factory, and it was apparently intended to poke fun at the company's founder and president, Tom Bin. Some people believe that the message was planted by Bin himself as a publicity stunt. And if that's the case, it worked.
Well, he gave himself a raise.
So there was a surge in sales, and in 2004, the company started publicizing which of its products carried the so-called Treason tags. They also marketed a T-shirt with the washing instructions on the front of it. So to me, the idea that this was a publicity stunt, it seems pretty plausible. So yes, the tag is real, but it's from 2004, and it's not a reference to Trump or Obama. It's possible that it's a dig at George W. Bush, but more likely, it's an inside joke at the manufacturer that resulted in a successful marketing campaign. So there you have it.
I feel like if this didn't get too viral that like everybody saw it, this could come back every 4 years and
Right.
it would be believable every 4 years.
Of course.
Well, it clearly has since 2004.
Yeah.
Social critics, you have to insult the person, not the office. Thanks, Pat. And now we turn to Adam to explore the Atacama mummified skeleton, who's probably been wearing at least one tag for quite some time.
That's right, Darren. A few years ago, back in 2013, a documentary looked at a mysterious skeleton or mummy found in the Atacama Desert in Chile. It suggested that this was actually an alien. I covered this back in episode 244 of the show, and now that this mysterious tiny mummy is in the news again, I thought it would be worth revisiting. I'll talk about what I covered in 2013, a bit of updates from the time, and what's been making headlines this past month. The specimen in question is a tiny humanoid-looking mummy measuring only 6 inches in height. Many photos of it don't give a great sense of scale, but one image I saw had it next to a pair of reading glasses roughly the size of the entire skeleton, to give an idea. It's small.
Those glasses don't fit at all.
Nope, they probably wouldn't. It was found in 2003, supposedly abandoned by the side of a church in the mining town of La Noria in the Atacama Desert. At the time of the discovery, the fact that this was so tiny caused many to wonder what was up. Possibilities suggested at the time were that it was a human with a disease, a non-human primate, or an unknown species, or perhaps an alien. There was a documentary released in 2013 called The Serious Documentary by Dr. Stephen Greer. I really don't recall having watched this, but apparently, in preparation for episode 244, I paid $10 to rent it and watched most of it. Now, most of the doc didn't really focus on the supposed alien boy, but rather about various alien conspiracy theories like ancient astronauts, old paintings actually showing spaceships, and that kind of stuff. Kind of stuff Stuart talks about on this show. The doc very much just calls this humanoid out as being an alien. There are oddities about it, aside from its size. It has an elongated head similar to a birth defect. It has 10 ribs instead of the usual 12 or 11, and it has an underdeveloped mid-face and jaw. Analysis in the documentary suggested that it was 6 to 8 years old and not a fetus. That's kind of what doesn't add up. Now, at the time, Gary Nolan did a bit of analysis on the skeleton's DNA from bone marrow. He determined that it was male because it had a Y chromosome, and that he died in the last century. He stated that he was human and not a non-human primate. It also seemed that the specimen had many mutations, but there was no mutation for dwarfism. There was no gene associated with progeria, a disease that causes a type of rapid early aging. Mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from the mother, showed that he likely came from the Atacama region. Basically, the mother was Chilean from around the region, probably not from another planet.
Probably.
Still, if the remains were of a 6 to 8 year old, this really meant that there was some sort of odd mutant that was only 6 inches in size. It's hard to picture something so small, but this is about half the size of a 12-inch Barbie doll. So this is a 6 to 8 year old child, half the size of a Barbie doll. So were such a person able to be born, breathe, and feed to the point of aging the better part of a decade, this would have been truly remarkable. The alien hypothesis wasn't really well supported at the time of the documentary, or even consistently supported by the documentary itself. The only indicator that it was is that the skeleton will kind of look like an alien because it was a bit deformed. But have any of you ever seen an ultrasound and thought, it kind of looks like an alien? Now, another idea at the time was that if you disregard the whole 6 to 8 year old thing, everything about this tiny human is consistent with the idea that it was a fetus or a stillborn birth. At the time of my original segment, an article on the topic was written by Stephen Novella at the Neurologica blog, arguing that this was likely the result of an illegal abortion. The deformities would have been the result of the abortion procedure itself. He argued that the skeletal changes, which made it seem to be a few years old, were just the result of the mummification process. Basically, it kind of impacted and crushed the bones down to make them look more developed. Now, if we ignore the age of the bones based on this, the specimen actually looks quite a lot like a fetal skeleton, something which certainly has odd proportions and that most people aren't familiar with seeing, but that's still what it looks like. The update doesn't actually change much from what we knew in 2013, but the new evidence is a bit more conclusive. Dr. Gary Nolan, who did the original DNA analysis in 2013, continued on that work for the past 5 years. A more thorough DNA sequencing was done with the help of others such as Sanchita Bhattacharya and Atut Bhoot from the University of California in San Francisco. The conclusion is now that the subject was actually female. So Ada, as she is being called, had her entire DNA sequenced, and they are more certain that she was human. Basically, not all of the DNA could be matched to a human because some of the DNA just couldn't be matched to anything at all. But 89.77% matched to human. Now, human to chimpanzee is actually a much higher match than that. But when they tried to match the DNA to a chimpanzee, they only got 88.01%. So that was less, indicating probably human. Also, only 64.79% matched to a rhesus macaque. So, the idea that it was maybe some sort of tiny monkey doesn't really add up because that DNA really did match human much more closely. Now, there were 2.7 million variants that were identified throughout her genome, and there were 54 rare mutations, and many of those are involved in building the skeleton. These include mutations in genes that were previously linked with diseases of small stature, rib anomalies, cranial malformations, premature joint fusions, and osteochondrodysplasia, also known as skeletal dysplasia. The DNA decay was consistent of a sample that was less than 500 years old. So this wasn't a very ancient sample. Actually, it was probably much more recent than that. The researchers speculate that these mutations may have caused the child to be stillborn and not aging to 6 to 8 years old. Stillbirths are common, with about 24,000 occurring in the U.S. each year alone, but doctors don't generally record their features or study their DNA. This case only led to more investigation because the skeleton itself in mummified state looked bizarre. So perhaps if a lot of the stillborn cases in the U.S. or elsewhere were really studied, and their DNA was studied, and those skeletons were studied, we might find some of them look like this. So to sum up, is it an alien being? Unlikely and unnecessary to the explanation. Is it a 6 to 8 year old child with a rare mutation that made her 6 inches tall? Well, it's way too complex, and there are way too many things that just don't add up to make that work. It's probably a fetus which was either aborted or more likely stillborn, and that seems to be the likely conclusion. So this really is all about anomaly hunting. Something was off with the sample instead of going to the most reasonable conclusions. In this case, that it was a fetus, we assume it's an alien or a tiny person or some other unknown species. Surely people don't really know what fetal skeletons look like, but someone researching skeletons should have some sort of idea. But there's an extra twist.
Oh.
Now, it doesn't really change the science angle, but there is another complication. Shortly after the release of the latest DNA analysis, the study was condemned as being unethical. The Chilean National Monuments Council has begun an inquiry into whether or not these remains were illegally exhumed in 2003 and smuggled out of the country. They suggest that the grave was plundered and the skeleton was stolen. Biological anthropologist Francisca Santana Sagredo said, and I quote, "It's offensive for the girl, for her family, and for the heritage of Chile." The researchers responded by stating that they had no knowledge or involvement in how these remains went from Chile to Spain, and that they had no reason to believe they were illegally obtained. Now, further, they mentioned that reports about these remains had appeared on Chilean television for 15 years without the government investigating the case. Now, indeed, with the documentary which was released 5 years ago suggesting this might be an alien being, there wasn't a ton of backlash at the time. The Chilean authorities refer to her as a girl, but they're only able to do so because the DNA research determined this. Most of what they know about her, including her sex, her heritage, and that she was likely stillborn, is due to that research itself. The researchers originally suspected these might be the remains of a non-human primate, which would not have required them to get permission to examine the sample. It's kind of an excuse they gave, but I think they did think that it being a human was a possibility, so that also needs to be considered. Now, as I stated earlier, the remains were found next to an abandoned church. They were found by a man named Oscar Munoz. They ended up in the private collection of Ramon Navia Osorio in Barcelona. Dr. Boot, who worked on the project, didn't see this as being disrespectful, stating, and I quote, "The study has provided a definitive scientific basis to put a stop to unscientific accounts of the skeleton's true human nature and accord it the respect it deserves. Not everyone sees it this way in Chile, with many in the scientific community condemning the study. The ethical objections have no impact on the scientific determinations of the analysis, but ultimately, these remains originate in Chile, and it seems like the scientific community of Chile has an issue with the research. The opinion of those in the country from which Ada originates should certainly be considered." The Atacama skeleton, sometimes called Ada, was certainly not an alien. Her DNA suggests that she was human and had a number of mutations, many of which may have affected her bones. Contrary to the surreal suggestions that she was a tiny 6 to 8 year old at the time of her death, she was likely stillborn. What we know about her, we know thanks to this new DNA research, which the Chilean scientific community condemns as being offensive. There is certainly a valid point to be made about the plundering of grave sites in Chile and elsewhere in the world. That said, these ethical concerns won't undo the research and make us unlearn what we know about Ada. At the very least, we can appreciate that the more outlandish theories about her identity are finally being put to rest.
Well said, Adam.
Wow.
Nice job.
Yeah, comprehensive. Nice.
Thanks, Adam. And an inadvertent bookending for the show. Did you know that Trump, a president, is Hitler? Sorry, I meant to say that Obama is Hitler. No, wait, I meant George W. Bush is Hitler. Or perhaps you've had an online discussion with someone and discovered that you are a Nazi.
Fair.
Or, in fact, you used your staggering powers of insight and discovered that someone else is a Nazi. And you kindly told them this fact. Did you ever notice that often online discussions eventually have a mention of the Nazis or Hitler? If so, you stumbled upon something called Godwin's Law. Who on the panel has heard of Godwin's Law?
I'm familiar with it.
I have heard various iterations of Godwin's Law.
I don't believe I've ever heard of it unless I just don't know what I know is called that.
Sounds like a good legal answer. I may know, but I'm not willing to say it this time, Your Honor. As Wikipedia states, it is an internet adage that asserts that, quote, "As an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Hitler approaches 1. That is, if an online discussion, regardless of topic or scope, goes on long enough, sooner or later some will compare someone or something to Adolf Hitler or his deeds, or his party. Formulated by attorney Mike Godwin, former general counsel for the Wikimedia Foundation, in the 1990s, it was originally specific to Usenet newsgroup discussions, but now it seems to be in anything involving discussions, comments, or rhetoric. Mm-hmm. In 2012, Godwin's Law became an entry in the 3rd edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Rational Wiki had a nice quote from Lewis Black, that cantankerous comedian. "It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, except there's just 1 degree, and Kevin Bacon is Hitler." Godwin was so frustrated by these comparisons in his Usenet discussions, he had to do something. Quoting Godwin himself, "So I set out to conduct an experiment, to build a counter-meme designed to make discussion participants see how they are acting as vectors to a particularly silly and offensive meme, and perhaps to curtail the glib Nazi comparisons. There are variations on the law as well. For example, there is a tradition in many news groups and other internet discussion forums that when a Hitler comparison is made, the thread is finished and whoever made the comparison loses whatever debate is in progress.
Yeah.
This principle is itself frequently referred to as Godwin's Law. Note that this is very similar to something called Arkin's Law, which states, a discussion is over when present society is compared to George Orwell's Oceana in the book 1984. Never heard of that one myself.
It's a good one, too.
The way Godwin is invoked leads some to think that you can't ever mention Hitler or the Nazis. But is that reasonable? Aren't some comparisons valid or useful? Yes, I think so. Thanks for the insight, Darren. Over to Bob with sports. More seriously, Kevin Drum and Glenn Greenwald, in separate pieces years ago, both argued that comparisons can have validity. First, there's a shared frame of reference. Drum writes, quote, "World War II analogies are extremely useful because they are familiar to almost everyone." This is true. If you discuss Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, fewer people will know the details of events. Almost everyone knows something about the Nazis being bad, doing some bad thing, though that recent survey said that younger people aren't that aware of the Holocaust. So, you never know. Second, to highlight that some horrible thing like the Holocaust could happen again. Meaning, the same tendencies still exist in humans, and if the conditions and societal structures change, such atrocities are possible on such a scale. If the law is used improperly, then people might not realize how problematic certain individuals and regimes are. If you outlaw comparisons, people may not realize that some things are actually similar to the Nazi war machine. Mm-hmm. Further, Godwin never said that comparisons can't be made. Quote, I urge people to develop enough perspective to do it thoughtfully. If you think the comparison is valid and you've given it some thought, do it. All I ask you to do is think about the human beings capable of acting very badly. We have to keep the magnitude of those events in mind and not be glib. Our society needs to be more humane, more civilized, and to grow up. Consequently, I think Godwin's law should remain descriptive about likelihood of Hitler or Nazi comparisons, but not the variation that says a discussion is lost if someone makes a comparison. Mm-hmm. There are times to make such comparisons. Just make a thorough case. The overall goal is to have constructive exchanges of ideas. Well, my naive hope is that it is. So reflect on it, know your audience, and make a good case if you think you can.
So that's really interesting, but I have to wonder whether or not it's true, whether or not that law is true. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds like a thing, and we've all seen it in online comments, but
how often does it really come up?
How often does it
it's a great point. And even he purposely called it a law. It's like, not a law. Some guy just made it up.
It's not like Moore's law. It's not that reliable, right?
Well, it's not even like the law of gravity law, which may have some issues in the quantum world. But some guy just said it as a description of things, and people generally think it's true. It's a good question, Pat, of how often people have online discussions of what type, right?
Because it might be like 6%, but that's still a lot. Because, you're arguing about Transformers and someone compares something to Nazis. It's like, okay, well, maybe Megatron kind of was like a Nazi, but still,
But even the question being, do longer threads tend to refer to Hitler or the Nazis more often than shorter threads, and how often is that true?
It may have to do more with
someone could do some math.
You're right. Some algorithm could try to crunch it. I would be tempted to say it must be true. Shouldn't say must. I'd be tempted to say it should be true or would be true, because you imagine a very short discussion. Hey, what's your favorite ice cream? Chocolate, vanilla, mint chip. You're like, and then that's it.
Nazi.
Yeah, well, exactly. Nazi's not a flavor. You're a Nazi for saying that.
But that discussion doesn't go on for a very long time.
Well, that's what I mean. So as the discussion increases, by definition, longer discussions will be more likely to have a Nazi comparison. Yeah. And anything that involves any sort of combat usually makes people antagonistic towards each other. So they'll end up calling someone something bad, and the obvious bad thing is Nazi or Hitler.
Well, it used to be, the landscape of online arguing has kind of changed. And it used to be that Nazi was thrown out as a pejorative of just like, you're a rule Nazi or you're a grammar Nazi or whatever. The current political climate is that people call people Nazis because they're white nationalists or they hate Jewish people or
True.
they're different kinds of comparisons, and I find that sort of different usage of Nazi maybe is less common.
Yes, there's a difference between soup Nazi and Nazi.
Sure.
But feminazi is a variant, one could say.
Yeah.
Right? And I do actually think some people who aren't white nationalists get called white nationalists / Nazis.
Absolutely.
That happens too. Like any good law, use it responsibly. And thanks for joining us once again. Pat explored treason tags, which may only be treasonous to the proprietor of the factory that created the merchandise, but maybe was also against every president everywhere in the world at all times. Adam looked at the Atacama mummified skeleton, which, surprise, surprise, turned out to not be an alien, and to probably be something from Earth. A fetus. And I gave you a little taste of Godwin's law, which says as the length of a discussion, typically online discussion, increases, a comparison to Hitler or Nazis approaches 1. Use it responsibly. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Takes.
Thanks, everyone, for giving me an alphabet soup of a show.
If we give Pat every letter, he can make any show. Make any show. I just do like a library of sounds. Sn, sna, snow.
That's funny. Here's a bunch of phonemes, Pat.
I mean, if you all just read the dictionary, then we'll just keep the show going for another 10 years.
There you go. Like, finally, I don't need those bums.